What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the GCSE psychology series. Moving on to section 2 of paper 1. So we've looked at memory and now we're going to be looking at perception. So starting off with, let's have a look at sensation and perception and start off by identifying what the difference is between the two. So sensation, this refers to the process of receiving raw sensory data via our sensory organs, things like light waves and sound waves through our eyes, ears, nose. These are sensations. Our perception is the process of interpreting and organizing this sensory information to make sense of the environment that we're in. The key difference between the two is that sensation is more about detecting stimuli, whereas perception is about understanding what the stimuli mean. So have a look at this really interesting table, which is just kind of a breakdown of our sensory receptor types. So we've got the modality, things such as vision. The receptors are our rods and cones within our eyes, and the receptor type are electromagnetic. The organ itself is the retina, and the stimulus is light. So you can see how it's broken down between the modality, receptor type, the organ, and the stimulus. So what's the process of sensation? Well, it starts off with our sensory receptors. These are specialized cells that detect specific forms of energy like light or sound. Transduction is the conversion of that sensory stimuli into neural signals for the brain to process. What about the process of perception? Firstly, organization. So we sort sensory data, example like grouping of colors and patterns and things like that. Identification, so recognizing what the object is, so identifying, like for example, like a chair or a table. And then of course interpretation, so making meaning from sensory data based on the experiences that we've been through in our lives. So we would only know that it's a chair because we've experienced a chair before, but there was a point in time when we never knew what a chair was. So we develop, if we think back to developing schema. So what do you guys see? So some people might have seen a duck, some people might have seen a bunny rabbit. So if we look between the two, if we look at the image, this is a well-known illustration, an optical illusion that can either be a duck or a rabbit. So let's start off by looking at binocular depth cues. Binocular depth cues require both eyes, such as the slight difference between images when we see with our left eye or with our right eye. So for an experiment, you could put your hand in front of your face, not too close, about an arm's length away, and just stare at your hand. Now close one eye, then close the other eye. That slight difference that we have is what's known as retinal disparity. And of course, our brains are such an advanced piece of machinery, it manages to take those two images and give us one image so we don't see double. Convergence. Convergence is when our eyes follow an object coming towards us and our eyes come closer together, i.e. there is convergence. Our eye muscles have to work harder. So if you take your finger, put it at arm's length again, and then slowly bring it towards the middle of your two eyes. And as you focus in on your fingertip coming towards your face, then your eyes will start to converge, so start to move together. You start to feel a slight strain in your eyes, and that's the eye muscles having to work harder. Retinal disparity. This happens because our eyes have two slightly different perspectives on how they view things due to their distance apart. So thinking back to what I explained a few minutes ago. Monocular depth cues. So the idea of the height in plane. Let's have a look at this illustration here on the right. So monocular depth cues, the height in the plane. So what does this mean? So this is the idea that objects that appear higher in the visual field appear to be further away. So if we look at this tree or this mountain, it is higher up in our viewing field, which means that it is further away. Relative size. So when objects appear smaller in the visual field than objects which are known to be of similar size. So again, if we look at these pillars on the bridge that the young lady is walking across, we can assume them to all be the same size, and I've done the illustration, so I'm telling you that they are the same size. But as they move further into the distance, they look smaller. So the relative size, so relative to how close the object is to us, will be dependent on how large the object appears. Occlusion. So when an object is behind or obscured by another object, they are understood to be further away. So again, here we can see on the young lady's leg, we can see that the bridge continues and it cuts off a bit of the lady's leg. And what that means is that this bridge is closer to us than her leg is. And that is what we call occlusion. So because it is in front, or if we take the example of the young lady herself here on her phone, the bridge that is passing, as we know, to be behind her, because she is appearing in front of the bridge, which means that she is closer to us than that side of the bridge is. Linear perspective. Lines that are parallel appear to get closer and come to a point in the distance. So anybody that's ever done perspective drawing will know, 1 point, 2 point perspectives, those are your vanishing points. So if we think in this regard here, if this bridge were to continue all the way off the page, then eventually these lines will get close. These two sides of the bridge will get so close together that they will appear to be touching. And that is the idea of that linear perspective. It's moving towards that single perspective point. Let's have a look at some more of these examples with some real life examples. So up here on the top left, we can see an example of height in plane. We see there are examples of other things that are happening here. There's some level of occlusion happening there, but we're focusing on the height in plane. So as we can see, the snooker balls that are higher up in the visual plane appear to be further away. So height in plane, the snooker balls that are further away are higher up in the picture. And then if we move across to the right here, we've got this nice image of a field with some trees in it. And again, when we think relative size, we can see that the trees that appear to be smaller physically only appear so because they're actually further away. In the bottom left here, we've got some examples of occlusion. So this gentleman here with his backpack on, we can see more of him because he is closer to us, and the people that are in front of him are being obscured by him because he is closer to us. And in the bottom right here, we have a brilliant example of linear perspective. So as we can see, the two parallel railway lines are appearing to move closer together the further away that they get. And this is, of course, the idea of convergence. Visual illusions. Let's have a look at what this is all about. So the idea of perceptual constancies. So things remain the same even though they may appear slightly different, but we know them to be constant. So for example, size constancies. The perception of an object as maintaining the same size despite changes in distance. So as we saw previously with relative size, we saw that the trees, even though we know them to be the same height or the same size, they appeared smaller the further away that they got, but we know that that size remains constant. Shape constancy. So perceiving an object as the same shape even when its image changes based on the viewing angle. So here we can see an example of a penny. We know that it is round, but as it rotates, it appears to be a different shape. But we know that that shape remains constant, and it's only because our viewing angle has slightly changed why it appears to be an oval. Color constancy. So the tendency to perceive colors as stable under different lighting conditions. So for example, if you're wearing a white shirt and you go into a room that's got really strong green lighting, your shirt will appear green, right? But you know that it hasn't been dyed green. You know that it's still white. It's just reflecting the green light and now appears green. But we know that that color remains constant. Misinterpreted depth cues. So here we've got a really interesting optical illusion known as the Ames room. And as you can see by this diagram, The room is a very odd shape. One corner is much further back than the, so for example, the left corner here is much further back than the right corner. And we can see where two people are requested to stand. So one person in the right corner and the other person in the left corner. But when we view through this specific peephole, then we get this really interesting optical illusion here, where it appears as though we have one giant person and one miniature person. But that's all based on the way that the room has been designed. So misrepresented depth cues occur when your brain receives visual information that suggests the wrong distance or depth of an object. This can make something look closer, further, larger, or smaller than it really is. Look at this really interesting illusion known as the Ponzo illusion here. So you see parallel lines appear to converge in the distance, causing objects to appear larger or smaller. So if I were to ask you guys, which one of these two red lines is longer? Give you guys a second to think about it, have a look. Which one do you think is longer? So you might have said the top line is longer. But when we remove the converging lines, then we see that they're actually both the same size or same length. The Muller-Lyer illusion, we see a very similar thing happening here. So we've got two lines, both ended with two arrow chevrons, one pointing inward and one pointing outward. Which line appears to be longer? Again, you wouldn't be by yourself if you said it was the top line that appears longer, because it does appear longer. However, they're both equal length, so two lines of equal length appear different due to the direction of the arrowheads at the end. So if we remove those arrowheads, you'll see that both lines are indeed the same length. So an ambiguous illusion. An ambiguous illusion is a visual image that can be interpreted in two or more distinct ways. Our brain switches between the possible interpretations, but the interesting thing is that you can only see one at a time. So for example, let's look at this called the Necker cube. If we start to follow the design of this cube just kind of with our eyes, then certain parts will pop out. So for example, if we focus here, we just follow this down, this appears to be closest to us, but then as we follow here, oh no, wait, actually it's inside. So as we follow the image around, then we see that it starts to kind of flip and transform before our eyes. Quite ambiguous. This is known as the Necker cube. Rubin's vase, another famous illustration or a famous optical illusion. What do you see? Do you see a really interesting looking green vase? Or do you see two faces facing each other? Well, whichever one you saw, you see both now. But what I can guarantee is that you're only seeing one at a time. So though you can see the vase, you can't also see the faces at the same time. So our brain only allows us to watch or to view or to see one at a time. Fictional illusions. What are they? Fictional illusions are images or patterns that trick the brain into seeing something that isn't really there. They create shapes, motion, or colors that don't exist in the real world. Let's look at an example of this. These illusions work because our brain tries to make sense of what we see by filling in the gaps, interpreting contrasts and guessing depth or movement, sometimes incorrectly. Let's check out the Kniza triangle. How many triangles do you see? Take a moment and count them. Done? How many triangles did you manage to count? Well, I can guarantee you that there isn't actually one triangle here at all. What we can see happening here is some shapes. So we've got these like little Pac-Man, green Pac-Man looking shapes. And we've got these chevrons that look like partial triangles. And what these do, these kind of create the outline of this black triangle. But we don't actually see the shape completed. Remember, a triangle's got 3 sides, and there isn't one completed triangle in this image, even though it looks like as though we have 2 triangles laid on top of each other. But that's our brain completing the shape for us rather than us actually seeing the triangles themselves. Theories of perception. So now let's try and get an understanding of why our brains work out and see things the way that they do. Now these theories are massively important when it comes to you guys doing your GCSE exam, paper 1. So let's take a look. So Gibson's direct theory of perception. So the direct theory of perception by Gibson. Gibson proposed that all the information needed for perception is directly available in the environment. The brain does not need to construct perceptions, but rather picks up information that is naturally present. So what do we see happening here on the left? We can see some trees moving past. We can see some interesting mountains in the background and some clouds. Let's look at some of the concepts that Gibson proposed. Optic flow. So he believes that the flow of visual information as one moves through the environment is what he knows as the optic flow. He took an ecological approach. He believes that perception occurs in real-world settings, not in isolation. What we see happening here on the left is a sensation known as motion parallax. And this refers to the ways objects appear to move at different speeds across our visual field as we move. Nearby objects seem to move faster, so that's the trees, while distant objects appear to move more slowly, so those would be the mountains and the clouds. This provides an important depth cue, helping us judge distance in a 3-dimensional environment. So we can kind of work out what is closer to us, what is further away by the speed at which it is moving. Let's take a look at Gregory's constructivist theory. So we had Gibson's direct theory, and now we're going to look at Gregory's constructivist theory. So Gregory had 2 methods of looking at things: top-down processing and bottom-up processing. But what's the difference between the 2? Top-down processing is the idea that information processing is guided by higher-level cognitive processes. So using past experiences and expectation to interpret sensory information. When you think top down, just think our brain is at the top of our body and we need that brain to process and to draw for past experiences and expectations and experiences that we've been through. Bottom up processing is the process of sensory information as it is coming in, or the processing of sensory information as it is coming in, from the basic sensory input to complex perception. So here we see Gregory himself. So the constructivist theory. Gregory argued that perception is not immediate, but is constructed from prior knowledge and experiences. The brain makes hypotheses based on limited sensory information, which leads to perception. Gregory emphasized that perception is hypothesis-driven, relying on previous experiences to interpret stimuli. Perception involves constructing a model of the world, and it relies heavily on past experiences. So we don't just kind of walk through life and just things happen to us. Gregory believes that we construct a model of the world that we're living in. Perceptual errors occur when hypotheses are incorrect, explaining illusions. The conclusion is that perception is a complex interplay of sensory input, cognitive processes, and prior knowledge. Different theories highlight various aspects from Gibson's direct perception to Gregory's hypothesis-driven approach. Understanding perception helps explain illusions, design principles, and even cultural variations in how we see the world. So let's start thinking about some of the factors that may affect perception. Culture. So Hudson's study of perceptual set and culture from 1960, again, an important study for you guys to be familiar with. So here we can see an image like a line drawing of a man with a spear, a little mini elephant, a tree, and it looks like some kind of gazelle or antelope. What was the aim of this study? The aim was to investigate whether people from different cultures interpret pictorial depth cues in the same way. The methodology: Participants were shown black and white line drawings depicting scenes with depth cues, example, a man with a spear and animals at different sizes, and we know that that represents different distances. There were different groups, and the groups included Bantu people from rural South Africa, and these people had low exposure to Western style pictures. Bantu and European urban school children who had more exposure to these kind of imagery. Participants were asked questions such as, what's the man doing? And which animal is closer to the man? The results were that rural, uneducated participants often failed to use depth cues and said the man was spearing the largest animal even if it was drawn to be further away. Educated participants and those more familiar with pictorial depth cues interpreted the images correctly, recognizing the smaller animal as being further away. Conclusion was that perceptual set is influenced by culture and experience. Exposure to pictures, education, and cultural norms affect how people interpret visual information. So what are some of the strengths of this study? Well, it supports the nurture in perception. So the idea of, that you can learn new things and that we learn from our environment and our upbringing. So nurture. It shows that perception is not purely biological and experience plays a massive role in it. This was an example of cross-cultural research. So it increases understanding of how culture affects behavior, making findings more generalizable. But what were the weaknesses of this study or the limitations? It had low ecological validity. Remember, ecological validity is all to do with how well something reflects real life. Line drawings are not real life 3D scenes, so results may not reflect everyday perception. Language barriers. Misunderstandings between researcher and participants may have affected responses, especially with rural participants. Cultural bias. Drawings use Western artistic conventions, which might have disadvantaged those unfamiliar with such images. Can emotion affect our perception? It's an interesting question. Let's have a look. So McGinney's study of 1949, Perceptual Set and Emotion. The aim of this study was to explore whether people are slower to recognize emotionally charged or taboo words compared with neutral ones due to emotional defense mechanisms such as repression. Method. Participants were shown words one by one using a tachistoscope, a device that presents words very briefly. Some words were neutral, example apple, chair, while others were emotionally charged or taboo, example sexual or swearing words. The exposure time of each word was gradually increased until the participants reported recognizing it. McGinney's also measured participants' physiological responses, for example, the galvanic skin response or GSR, to see if there was emotional arousal. What were the findings? Participants took longer to recognize taboo words compared to neutral words. GSR readings showed a higher physiological response to taboo words, suggesting emotional arousal. McGinney's concluded that emotion can influence perceptual set. People may have a form of perceptual defense where recognition of emotionally threatening or uncomfortable words is delayed. This could be due to unconscious processes protecting the individual from emotional distress. So what are some of the strengths of this study? It's an objective measurement, so the use of a tachistoscope and GSR provided quantitative data, making the results more reliable and less open to interpretation. It supports the theory, so findings give experimental support for the idea of perceptual defense, showing how emotion can affect perception. It was a controlled procedure. The same words and exposure times were used for all participants, which improves internal validity. What were the weaknesses of this study? Well, it was an artificial task. So recognizing words on a screen is not something we normally do in everyday life, is it? So the study may lack ecological validity. Individual differences. Some people might simply be more uncomfortable with taboo words than others, which could affect recognition time. It's quite outdated. So the study is quite old, 1949, and cultural attitudes towards taboo words have changed. Modern replication might find different results. If you think about it, back in like the 40s and 50s, swearing and these kind of things weren't as rife as they were now. It wasn't on the TV, you couldn't see it, like you wouldn't hear it in music. So people were less desensitized to swear words, so the response may be significantly different today. How does motivation impact perception, if at all? Let's have a look. Gilchrist and Nesberg's study. So the aim of this study was to investigate whether being hungry, a motivational state, would affect how people perceive pictures of food. Specifically, whether hunger changes the perceived brightness of food images. The broader question, does motivation influence perception? The method. Participants, 26 university students, split into two groups. The experimental group were not allowed to eat for 20 hours, so they were hungry. The control group were allowed to eat normally. The task. Participants were shown pictures of food, neutral objects and non-food objects projected onto a screen. They were asked to adjust the light beam so that it matched the brightness of the images they were viewing. So what were the findings? Hungry participants judged food pictures as brighter than non-hungry participants did. No significant difference for non-food objects was found, and the conclusion was that motivation, in this instance hunger, can alter visual perception, making food appear more vivid or appealing when we are deprived of it. Can expectation impact our perception? Let's have a look. So let's start off by looking at the Brunner and Minturn study of 1955. What do you guys see? Do you see the number 13? Or do you see the letter B? What about now? What about now? Did your perception change? So the background of this study. This study was conducted in 1955 to investigate how perceptual set influences ambiguous stimuli. We often see what we want to see, as we just noticed. So we were given an ambiguous figure. Participants were shown a figure that could either be interpreted as a B or a 13. The methodology. Participants were primed with either letters, example A, B, C, or numbers, example 12, 13, 14. Their interpretation of the ambiguous figure was recorded. Findings. Participants' perceptions were heavily influenced by the context provided by the priming, and this demonstrated how prior knowledge and expectations influence perception. So if they saw A and C, then they expected the middle to be B. If they saw 12 and 14, then they expected the middle to be 13. The strengths of this study is that it was a well-controlled experiment with clear variables. Direct evidence for the role of perceptual set was also evident. The weaknesses of this study, it had limited generalizability due to its artificial setting. Simplistic nature of the task may not really represent complex real-life scenarios. So what do we take away from this? Well, perception is influenced by cognitive, cultural and emotional factors. Brunner and Minturn's study remains a foundational piece in understanding perceptual biases. Practical implications span law enforcement, education and also design. Hopefully that gives you guys a better understanding of perception. We decided to put everything into the one video here. So again, that is from section 2 of your paper 1 GCSE AQA exam. Hope you guys found it interesting. I hope you guys managed to understand what it is that we were going into. Catch you guys in the next one. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.